This is Human Coined, a series that unpacks the mechanics of public finance, the complexities of democracy, and the societies they ultimately shape. I'm your host, Jeff Dubrow. Join me in a social dialogue that cracks open important issues that are too often ignored here at home and around the world. Mae Buenaventura, it's a pleasure to have you back on the podcast. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. Good evening from the Philippines. I'm Mae Buenaventura, working with the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development.
And Janet Bamashea from the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. Good to have you.
Thank you, Jeff. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to this.
Mae, let's start with you. Janet's going to join me a little bit later as a guest interviewer, but let's start with you. If you could talk a little bit about the benefit of country debt alliances. And I say country because I'd like to start by talking about the country level as opposed to a sort of regional level.
Yeah, so I can only share with you my experiences, of course. And a very clear benefit of having country alliances is, of course, they're very much in touch with the issues on the ground. No? They know the issues, they know the language, we know cultural practices also and beliefs, so we need to adjust that as well. But this is not to say that bigger alliances they're absolutely necessary, I think, and we actually have a metaphor for how we work, which is how we cook rice cakes in the Philippines, which is coals at the bottom and coals at the top. So it's this dynamic between the national, the regional, and the global, because we're addressing different actors. And of course, when you're bigger, that makes for bigger impact rather than if you're only one country speaking out on a specific debt issue, right?
Can you give an example of a debt alliance that exists in an Asian country?
Yeah, so here in the Philippines, I'm also a member. My national organization is called the Freedom from Debt Coalition. It was born during at the very time that we ousted the dictator Marcos, the father of our current president, and this was because the government pledged to pay all debts as a matter of honor, which we of course challenged. We challenged because this is debts of an illegitimate regime. It was a dictatorship, and we were saying that those debts, not only did you not consult us, they resulted in violations of human rights and other harms, no, to the environment, to communities, and so on. So it's been around for a long time. It continues to exist. It continues to campaign against laws that promote debt dependence and debt accumulation, including also the links between climate that debt reinforces, indebtedness reinforces, and also new with a trend right now of public-private partnerships, which also carries hidden fiscal risks, including debt. So that's my national organization, and that organization is also part of regional and global alliances.
So how complicated is it to get a debt alliance started? Like, for example, you mentioned the debt alliance that exists in the Philippines. You start off with many different organizations with very disparate mandates and disparate goals. How do you bring them together to have an initial conversation about forming that alliance?
Okay. Yeah. So there's a diversity, of course, in terms of, for example, of the specific sector they're working in, the specific issues of that sector. But there's also overarching unities, like how do they see changes in society happening? What is their vision of a society that they'd like to build? So you cannot build an alliance with totally divergent members. No, there must be some level of shared unity, shared agenda, and goals. Because otherwise, what are you in an alliance for? if you don't have those commonalities, no? So those shared vision and goals is the basis for you coming together, because you recognize that there's greater strength in more people, more organizations working together, sharing resources, having a wider reach, no?
How do you keep them together? How do you keep those organizations together? You know, it's great to get people together or get organizations together on day one, but how do you keep that renewed sense of mission
Yeah.
and purpose and avoid the fragmentation of
Yeah,
the
so
organization falling apart?
as with any alliance, but perhaps more so with alliances that aim for social change, it's really challenging because the changes do not come fast. You know, like you don't like it's not a livelihood project where you see changes in maybe 6 months, like you're going to harvest so and so crops. This if you're because it's working on social change, the gains are can be very incremental, and so that needs real commitment,
Mhm.
real passion that slowly but surely you are moving closer to what you aspire for. There's also, of course, as alliances go, we reach unities by consensus, no? Not That's the organizational culture, by consensus and not dividing the house. So that goes through processes of consensus building. Like if one member does not agree with you on certain issues, you start that process of discussing with them why does the alliance need to fight for this or protest against this and so on. So it's quite painstaking work, that which means it's very important that the leadership has this constancy with the principles of the organization, no? That that faith in the common agenda and in your conviction in what you're fighting for, because otherwise it's going to be like headless chicken running around, and of course that will lead to the breakup of the alliance itself. There's also threats of from outside, like political repression. So during
Very good
the
point.
dictatorship, we had very direct experiences with that, with harassment, with arbitrary arrests of our leaders. That takes that takes a real strong level of nothing will phase you. Nothing so strong is your belief that this is worth the cost is worth it. That you stay the course, and you don't we don't just hide or retreat or. So that continues to this day,
For a
even
debt,
under
sorry,
this. Yeah, those kind of repressive acts continues to this day among our members.
yeah, that's really interesting, actually. And of course, that's as a Canadian, that's not the first thing that I think of. So you're absolutely right. It's very important to note that there are many countries, political activists do face that type of oppression. I appreciate you raising that. What would your advice be for any new debt alliance in a country that has recently experienced debt distress and is going through an IMF agreement? How would that guide their mandate in terms of the action that they take as a debt alliance?
Yeah. Well, I believe that before you reach that stage where you're going to set up the alliance, there needs to be processes before that. So, very important to have broad consultations with people that you want to be part of the alliance, or, you know, asking them, we think this is something we need to do. What do you think? And really asking them that they're involved in the process of setting up the alliance even before it is formally built. So usually that takes the form of a working group of a manageable size of people, not yet many, but a working group that will do the reaching out while monitoring issues, and then also starting to respond already, even if the alliance is not yet set up, and uh, gaining strength along the way towards a point where you gather enough strength to say, perhaps we have basis to formalize ourselves as an alliance. So there's a lot of work before you even reach that point of building the alliance.
And from a mandate perspective, what would you advise that the working group focus on? I can certainly rattle off some potential areas, but do you have any initial advice or thoughts on that?
Is that you? Are you particularly referring to a debt working group?
No, a debt working group or debt alliance. So in light of an IMF agreement and in light of being in debt distress, would the working group, what would sort of be the priority areas for that working group to focus on? Would it be related to, ensuring that whatever fiscal space is remaining is being used in an equitable way? And those are the type of questions that Janet is going to pose to you in a couple of minutes. Would it be related to, for example, ensuring that debt commitments are actually being paid off? So if there's an IMF agreement, that those commitments are being paid off. Would it be related to strengthening debt management guidelines and debt management legislation to ensure that the government is more capable of paying in the future? Would it be bringing in, finding entry points for civil society and parliament, for example? What would you sort of see as the priority areas?
Yeah, so it really depends on the people you talk to. If that's a national based, if that's a working group based in a country, it really depends on the people you communicate with. What do they think are urgent, and what is within their capacity? Because they may recognize as part of the narrative all those issues you mentioned, but because of capacity at the beginning stages of organizing, it may not be possible to address all. So, is it an issue that threatens, for example, certain sectors that we need to act quickly, or is it going to be a working group that's more on the research type, or a working group more on the campaigning type? So it depends also on how you define that space of the working group. But the value of that is it's a start. It's a start that you can build on, because otherwise there's just individuals talking, for example, about the debt in Sri Lanka, or guesting in webinars. But together, if there's some kind of those efforts that hold a promise of bigger things to come in the form of coalitions or alliances, I that's the value of starting small, starting specific, and really, that people are the ones driving it and not outside factors.
That's really interesting. So I'm going to turn it over to Janet in a second, but I just wanted to say my learning from what you're saying is that you could start small with a working group, and it may take a couple of years to morph into a formal alliance. But a working group would be focusing on more specific issues, and then as the consensus grows, the momentum builds. You start widening the scope and widening the organizations and bringing in bylaws, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Janet Belmashai from the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. You had a couple of questions you were going to ask Mae about inclusivity and debt alliances.
Yes, that's correct. So, nice to meet you again. I do think with the increasing debt situation, inclusive policies are becoming more and more important. So, how can the Debt Alliance create more awareness on the importance of inclusive policy with a limited fiscal debt situation?
Mm. Yeah, so even if it's small and just in the starting phases, I think it's important to be clear amongst the initial members what the guiding principles are, as even in their even broadly, no, there's agreement on guiding principles like participation, democratic processes, transparency, and so on. And one of that should include also women and gender. No, so in many Asian countries, you often see, uh, even amongst progressive organizations, you often see leaderships that are dominated by men, and it really takes a purposive action to push that there be gender parity, or gender sensitivity to those issues. So the working group could make that a principle, a guiding principle, include in addition to how they conduct themselves process wise. They should also include that, I think, that there should be gender balance, for example, in who's leading. Certain tasks could be rotated, and it's not only the women who take the notes or document, as is usually the case, or do the cooking while the meeting is going on, things like that. So, and then also, we also have inclusivity, also means that we think about the rural urban divide, because it's usually people from the urban areas, who have a lot of education, who are more articulate and express themselves. And an extra effort needs to be done to bring in uh, individuals who may be farmer leaders or indigenous peoples who are not used to such spaces. So you need to provide the conditions where they can safely feel safe enough to express themselves and participate democratically in the discussions of the working group.
Yeah, I think you touched briefly on the impacts of debt policy on gender, and that's an area I just want to delve deeper into, because it's generating a lot of interest now. Is the alliance doing anything in that space? The effect of the debt policy on things like gender, climate? Are you beginning to look into other areas as such?
Yeah. So to me, a debt justice alliance, that is key in a debt justice alliance. Like my own organization, because women leaders were very actively engaged. So they're also feminists. So it made sure that in the mandate of my national organization, there is a clear recognition of both reproductive and productive work. So institutionally, you have an organization that recognizes the care work of women as work and as part of that should be valued in the economy, because mainstream economics does not value that. Does not give remuneration for that, and it's just assumed that women will take up the fault what they can no longer afford to buy from the market due to privatization, for example.
Thank you, May. I think that's everything from me at the moment.
That's amazing, May. I know you have to jump off in a moment, but I just want to say that I think, I was focusing on the term debt alliance, but the minute you bring in the word justice, everything seems to make more sense. It's that when you're talking about justice, you're talking more about inclusivity, equality, the need to improve processes, et cetera, et cetera. So that's, I think in itself, that's a very, very helpful term. And I think I'm going to go ahead and use the term debt justice alliance now instead of debt alliance.
Yeah,
Thank
because
you.
that would mean the process itself should be just and fair and transparent, and equally important as what you establish later on as more formal arrangements.
That's right. Well, May, thank you very much for taking the time to be a guest on the podcast again. As you know, I plan to use some of our discussion for training purposes. So your voice will be multiplied in many different ways as a result of our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Yeah.
And Janet, thanks again for joining as a guest interviewer. I really appreciate your questions.
Thank you, Jeff. It's always a pleasure.
Humankind is an integral part of Nexus PFM Consulting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also find us on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions about the work we do, you can contact us at info@nexuspfm.com.